Welcome to the Natural Super Kids podcast, where you will discover practical strategies to inspire you to boost the health and nutrition of your kids. I'm Jessica Donovan, a qualified naturopath specialising in kids' health, and I want to make it as easy as possible for you to raise healthy and happy kids. Let's get into it. Hello. Welcome back to the Natural Super Kids podcast. We're going to dive straight into part 3 of our eczema series. So today we are talking about triggers. What is triggering your child's eczema? Some of the common triggers, some of the surprising triggers, food and environmental triggers we are talking about today. If you have missed the last 2 episodes, you can go back and listen to those at any point. You don't really have to listen to them in any particular order. In part 1 of our eczema series, so 2 weeks ago, we chatted about the underlying causes, underlying factors that you need to know as a parent when it comes to eczema. We talked about immune dysregulation, we talked about gut microbiome balance, and we talked about skin integrity. We're going to touch on some of those topics in today's episode as well. And then in last week's episode, in part 2 of our eczema series, we talked specifically about steroid creams and why they are not the long-term solution to your child's eczema. I'm not saying never use them, but we talked about some of the downsides, the side effects. We talked about topical steroid withdrawal, and we talked about the reason that they are not the golden bullet, I was going to say. I don't think that's right. They're the answer. They're the long-term answer to your child's eczema. Why we want to be looking at those underlying factors. And to sum it up, really, steroid creams can be great at addressing that skin inflammation. So they can be really good at getting on top of symptoms quickly, but they're not doing anything to address the underlying cause. So they really are a Band-Aid solution. So please go back and listen to those episodes if your child has eczema. I also want to just mention that we have our eczema workshop. This is something that you can purchase. It contains everything you need to know about healing your child's eczema naturally. It's our 6-step approach to healing eczema naturally. It's the same approach we use with our one-on-one naturopathic clients. It's the same approach we recommend and encourage our Natural Super Kids Club members to implement when looking at healing eczema. It's easy to understand, it's easy to implement, and I'll make sure the link to that is in the show notes. But if you want to check it out, you can go to naturalsuperkids.com/eczema and you will find all of the details there. It's under $50 to purchase, and it really is, we've had so much good feedback from people who have watched and implemented what we recommend in that workshop in terms of the improvements that they've seen on their kids' eczema. So today we are talking about the triggers. Now, sometimes it can feel like your child's eczema flares are random. 1 minute their skin's clear, the next minute it's inflamed, it's red, it's itchy. And this can come down to things that are triggering the eczema. So in this episode, I want to explore, the common triggers that could be making your child's eczema flare up or worse. Now, I do just want to say here also that removing triggers is only part of the picture. Yes, investigating what your child's triggers might be and, removing those as best you can. Look, this is easier with dietary triggers because we do have full control over what goes into our mouth, although it's not easy, but it's more simple. And it's possible. With environmental triggers, it can almost be impossible to manage because we can't always we're not always in control of what our kids are being exposed to environmentally. We're going to be talking about dust mites today. That's a common trigger, and it's just impossible to get rid of dust mites completely. So removing the trigger food or reducing that exposure to the environmental trigger, again, it's only part of the picture. We still want to be addressing and working on those underlying imbalances, the immune system, the gut, and the skin integrity, which I talked about in detail in part 1 of this podcast series. So I did just want to mention that. But let's talk about food triggers first. So the most common food triggers are dairy, eggs, gluten, soy, citrus, tomatoes, nuts can be in there as well. So these are just some of the more common culprits, but there can also be a whole range of other foods that can be triggering your child's eczema. Dairy is the most common food allergy in children. It's almost, from what I have seen, the most common food trigger. So that's always a good one to start with or to be aware of. Now, I do want to also just touch on the difference between allergies and intolerances or sensitivities here as well, because you might go and get allergy testing, skin prick testing for your child's allergies. Nothing might come up or one thing might come up. It doesn't mean that they don't have sensitivities or intolerances to other foods. So there is a difference between true allergies, which are IgE responses, and intolerances or sensitivities, which are IgG responses. So you can have a bit of a mixture of both. Skin can be triggered, eczema can be triggered by both allergies and or intolerances. Allergies are much easier to diagnose through testing. I'm not a huge fan of food intolerance or sensitivity testing. We generally work on figuring that out through food elimination and reintroduction and, taking a very careful history when we're working with clients, and we can often pinpoint, some of those more sensitivity intolerance issues. But I do just want to say that just because your child has had allergy testing and nothing's come up or a certain food hasn't come up doesn't mean it's not triggering eczema. So that can make it very murky and messy, right? So if your child has eczema and you feel like it could be related to food, it's always a good idea to, take a food journal, keep track of what your child's eating and when their eczema flares. It's not always going to be really obvious to you looking at a food diary or a food journal, but that can be gold when and if you go and get some professional support from a practitioner. We help parents with this all the time in our one-on-one naturopathic consultations, in our online clinic. Nutritionists and naturopaths always find a lot of value when you have got a food journal or a food diary, because we can pick up pictures, we can pick up patterns that you might not see as well. The other thing that makes this really tricky is just because your child is like a flaring up 1 minute, it doesn't mean it's the food that they've eaten just before that flare up either. So reactions can be delayed, and with food sensitivities and intolerances, they can be up to 72 hours delayed. So it might be what your child ate yesterday, and there might also be this tolerance point. So your child might be okay with a little bit of dairy, but if they go over their threshold or over their tolerance level, they might get a flare up. So it's always a really good idea to get professional support, and we walk you through this in detail in our eczema workshop if that's something that interests you. But yeah, foods can definitely trigger eczema, and the most common culprits are the ones that I listed before. I also want to talk a little bit about histamine intolerance. So I actually saw this being talked about very briefly in a news report recently. There's been some research, the medical world is catching up with what us naturopaths have known for a long time, that histamine intolerance is often at play with eczema. So this is making it into, the mainstream medicine and mainstream news recently. I should have looked up that article or the news before I hit record, but I didn't. But as I said, us naturopaths have always known this. I can think of one of our Natural Super Kids Club members who joined the club. Her daughter had eczema, and through the resources and the support that she got within the Natural Super Kids Club, she we helped her determine that her child had histamine intolerance, and addressing that histamine intolerance has made the world of difference, not just to her daughter's eczema, but also to her hay fever symptoms as well, which she was struggling with terribly. So let me talk you through histamine intolerance briefly. So some kids have trouble breaking down histamine. Now, histamine is a natural compound found in certain foods. You would have also heard of histamine as in like antihistamine medication, which helps to reduce histamine in the body. But what a lot of people don't know is that histamine is a natural compound found in certain foods. And when histamine builds up, it can trigger eczema, it can trigger hay fever-like symptoms, rashes, itchiness. So some signs of histamine overload are the itchy skin, the flushing skin, child that's prone to, sensitive skin and hives, but also those more hay fevery symptoms, runny nose, itchy eyes, sneezing. Histamine overload can also cause issues with mood and sleep as well. So some of the foods that are high in histamine are things like aged cheeses, processed meats, fermented foods, so things like sauerkraut, kombucha, yogurt. So if your child is, if you're trying to increase those gut-friendly fermented foods and your child's eczema is getting worse, that's a real red flag that, oh, hang on, histamine intolerance could be at play here. Leftover food also increases in histamine, and there's certain fruits and veggies that are high in histamine as well: spinach, tomatoes, strawberries, avocado, bananas, to name a few. So you can see how this can be really hard to pick up, and histamine is high in a lot of healthy foods. So what it means when your child has histamine intolerance is that their histamine bucket is overflowing, if you like. So we want to reduce that load of histamine in a child's diet while we support the gut and the immune system to improve that tolerance to histamine. So with histamine intolerance, we're always aiming to, yes, reduce histamine load in the diet, but also support that gut immune function so that the system tolerates more histamine in the long term. So that is histamine intolerance in a nutshell. And that really is often at play when it comes to eczema, as well as those more, common food triggers that I talked about before. So let's talk about environmental triggers now. So this can be a whole range of things. Some kids are triggered by things like soaps and body washes, particular ingredients within these products, bubble baths, detergents, cleaning products. These triggers can be, yes, the more chemical-based products, but they can also be, more of the natural-based products as well. So chemicals and even natural chemicals within those personal care and cleaning products can be triggers for some kids. Dust mites is huge. I remember this one particular case early on in my career as a naturopath. I had this stubborn case of eczema, and, all the normal dietary elimination and reintroduction and working on gut health, we were getting some improvement, but we just weren't managing to kind of complete the picture. The parents were working so hard. They were, really staying on track, implementing everything that I recommended. And what was missing was this child ended up being having dust mites as one of their sensitivities. They were triggered. They had an allergy to dust mites. We eventually found out. So dust mites can be a huge part of eczema and hard to manage, in terms of we can't kind of eliminate dust mite exposure completely. But I'm just planting that seed that dust mite intolerance, sensitivity, allergy can be at play. And it's actually really common in kids. A really typical sign that a child has issues with dust mites is that they wake up in the morning congested, because often dust mites are high in the bedroom. And so we really want to try and minimize that exposure to dust mites by minimizing soft furnishings, using a HEPA HEPA vacuum cleaner, which really helps to, remove those dust mites. It's a particular filter that we can get. So if you're buying a vacuum cleaner, or if your child has an issue with dust mites, a HEPA vacuum cleaner filter is very important. And things like, simple things like vacuuming the mattress, getting rid of soft toys, and even carpet. I had one client once that ripped up the carpet in their kid's bedroom, and it made the world of difference. So I know that's not always possible. Some people rent or that sort of thing. But yeah, environmentally, dust mites can be a big factor. Mold as well, pet dander, are very common. Sometimes grasses and pollens can be at play as well, particularly if eczema is getting worse in the springtime with those hay fevery type symptoms, and that can all very much be intertwined with histamine intolerance as well. So as you can see, it's a bit of a minefield. It's very hard to work this stuff out yourself. So it's always a really good idea to get support from a practitioner that is well-versed in eczema, well-versed in allergies, intolerances, and these food and environmental triggers that can be at play. Really helps to take that mental load of figuring all of this out off of you and onto a practitioner that is sort of more knowledgeable. And as I said, we go through all of this and more as part of our eczema workshop. And we also offer one-on-one consultations for support in this area with our naturopaths in our online clinic. So we've talked about common food triggers. We went into quite a bit of detail about histamine intolerance. We've talked about those environmental triggers as well, and focused specifically on dust mites, because I do find that to be the most common environmental trigger, but there can be others, as I said, as well. Now, I just want to go back to that point to make sure that everyone kind of gets that a trigger causes a flare, but it doesn't, removing that trigger is still not addressing the underlying cause of why the eczema is happening in the first place, why the body is so sensitive to that particular trigger. And that's why it's really important to work through those 6 steps that we talk about in our eczema workshop. So both need to be addressed for long-term relief. Yes, we need to remove the trigger short-term, or minimize the exposure to that trigger short-term, while we work on regulating the immune system, improving that gut microbiome diversity and gut health in general, improving that skin barrier integrity. These are all things I go into detail about in the first episode of this series on eczema. So you can work on reducing the triggers while you work on that deeper underlying cause or imbalance that's going on for your child's eczema. So you can see that eczema is, it's multifactorial. There's a lot of things at play. And I think this is why we get such amazing results naturopathically, and we have so much to offer naturopathically when it comes to eczema, because we really do zoom out and look at that holistic approach. Eczema is not about slapping on some steroid cream, and I hope this series has really helped you to realize that. So understanding your child's specific triggers is a really important part of the picture, and that's what we've talked about in this episode. So we talked about those food triggers, the histamine intolerance, the environmental triggers, and remember to go back to episodes 1 and 2 in this series if you missed them, to learn more about those underlying causes, and also the second part where we talked about steroid creams as well. So we would love to teach you more about our specific approach when it comes to eczema and see the results that you can get for your children. Head on over to naturalsuperkids.com/eczema for all of the details on our eczema workshop. It's under $50 in terms of the investment, and it contains everything you need to know to heal your eczema, your child's eczema naturally. It can work for adults as well, by the way. I hope this has been really helpful. Please reach out if you have any questions. You can reach out jessica@naturalsuperkids.com via email, or you can send us a DM on Instagram. Thanks so much for listening. And if you know a parent who is struggling with their child's eczema, I would love for you to send them this episode so they can have a listen as well. Thanks so much. We'll be back next week. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Head on over to our website, naturalsuperkids.com, for the show notes for this episode, as well as a whole heap of inspiration to help you raise healthy and happy kids. I'll see you next week.